Hello. Today I want to talk about how to read Paul Tillich. So, say you're interested in Tillich as a theologian, as a philosopher or thinker. I just want to go over some of my recommendations for the books that you might be considering reading, maybe the order you might want to read them in, as well as a few secondary books. I've recently written a book on Tillich called Paul Tillich in Plain English, and so I talk about a fuller bibliography in that book, but I wanted in this video to kind of give some thoughts on how you might go about reading Tillich. Tillich can be a difficult thinker to understand. He's very nuanced. He has a lot of different works that cover a lot of different subjects, and so it can be a little bit daunting to look at his body of work and to try to figure out where to start. And so hopefully this video is helpful for you to read Tillich. My book or any of my videos on Tillich are ultimately to try to encourage you to read them for yourself. I think that the best service that you can do for yourself as a theologian, a pastor, somebody interested in Christian thought, is to read some of these complex thinkers and challenge yourself to read them. I think they are readable if you have the patience and the diligence to kind of go through their work. And I've found with any major figure, any major theologian, that it's helpful to just kind of grab onto different ideas in their work that you find really accessible or helpful for you personally. Maybe come to Tillich or a different theologian like Barth with a particular theological question and pursue that question, and I think that can kind of help unlock the broader scheme of their work, especially with somebody like Tillich. Tillich's thought is so interconnected that if you kind of grasp a certain area of his thought, you'll start to see the connections between all of the other aspects of his thought. So he's a really fascinating theologian. I had a really enjoyable time reading his work, studying his work for this new book, Paul Tillich in Plain English. But if you want to read Tillich, you should really focus on his main theological work, which is his Systematic Theology. This is the 1-volume version of it, but it's in 3 volumes. It's a dense book, but you should try to focus on reading it. That can be a daunting task, so maybe you don't want to dive into that right away. Usually just a default book that I recommend to people as a short dive into Tillich is his Dynamics of Faith. This is a really good introduction to Tillich. It's fairly short, one of his clearer books, and that's a very good one to start with. I think that his history lectures, this is a little bit of a thicker book, a little bit denser. His history lectures are very helpful for contextualizing Tillich's theology. Tillich kind of gets this bad rep as being a theologian who's so philosophical, so existential that he's no longer really even a Christian theologian. This shows something quite contrary, that he's deeply rooted in the historical Christian faith in a profound way, and he was a good historian in that sense. He has some really good material in here that I really enjoyed, and so this is a good version of it, compiled by Carl Bratton, and very much recommend that. This was a recommendation given to me by my professor at Luther Seminary, Lois Malcolm, who recommended that this is an essential book for understanding Tillich. And so this one would be worth getting to eventually. It's denser, so maybe not the first book you get to. And then Tillich always stressed the importance of reading his sermons for understanding him. And so he has 3 published volumes of sermons: The Eternal Now, The New Being, and Shaking the Foundations. This one's a little worn, so you can't really read it, but Shaking the Foundations, being these loosely correspond to the 3 volumes of Systematic Theology, but they are really insightful for understanding how Tillich preached his theology. He often preached in front of audiences that weren't explicitly churchgoers, and so I talked in my Paul Tillich in 5 minutes video that Tillich's thought does try to present the Christian message in a way that it can be meaningful and powerful for people today, and this kind of represents a lot of how he tried to do that. Another book I really enjoyed, Theology of Culture, is an important idea for Tillich, and this was a very good book not only for understanding that idea, because this is the mature expression of it. He gave a lecture earlier in his career about theology of culture, but this is a mature expression of that idea in his thought. It introduces not only that, but a number of the key themes within Tillich's work that are really helpful, and so I found this quite useful. Another book that's short that not a lot of people I think read, but I think was really, really powerful for me for understanding Tillich is Biblical Religion and the Search for Ultimate Reality. It's kind of hard to see. This is a hardback version of it, obviously. It's a shorter book. It does a good job of also showing Tillich's kind of rootedness in the biblical tradition. And so I make the argument in my book that Tillich really is a biblical and a historically Lutheran and Pauline theologian, that he gets this bad rap of being overly modern to the point of losing historical Christian faith, but I think this does a good job of showing his nearness to the scriptures. And so I enjoyed that book a lot. One of his most famous books is The Courage to Be. This is in a nice like second or third printing of the one of the early editions, I think, of it, that I picked up somewhere, probably online fairly cheaply. So it's kind of a cool edition. But The Courage to Be is Tillich's probably one of his best known works. He does try to do a bit more psychological stuff in this book, but it is still a deeply theological book, particularly around his definition of the courage to be as a kind of grace. And so this is a insightful one. It is dense. I think this is more challenging, and so people that pick this up first, I think, are mistaken. It's maybe something to get to later. So it's important for Tillich, but something later. Quite a approachable volume is this one, Ultimate Concern, Tillich in Dialogue. It's edited by Mackenzie Brown. This is kind of a record of student dialogues with Tillich. So Tillich kind of had this informal dialogue with some students, and it's a really helpful book because he's really just more direct, more conversational. He presents a lot of his ideas in a really clear way. So this, if you find Tillich difficult in any of the other readings, this would be a really great one to get to really understand him. And then finally, it's important to locate Tillich within his situation. He was the theologian of correlating the Christian message to the existential situation. And so it's important to understand Tillich's own biography. He wrote several different autobiographical reflections. These two are really helpful ones. The first is On the Boundary. In my video, Paul Tillich in 5 minutes, I talk about Tillich being a boundary theologian. This is where that language comes from. He described himself that way as a theologian who lives on the boundary. And it's a really interesting and helpful concept for understanding him and why he's sometimes difficult, because I think a lot of interpreters of Tillich or critics of him want him to be one thing or the other, but Tillich very much was happy living on the boundary between philosophy and theology, for example, between Lutheranism and Marxism. He talks about that in a few other polarities in this book. My Search for Absolutes is another autobiographical work, and it's helpful. It's a little bit more theological. It has a lot of really interesting ideas in it, but also a good book. The best, that as far as I'm aware, biography of Tillich, the more classical one at least, is this is by William and Marion Pock. I think I'm saying that correctly. Paul Tillich, his life. It comes with a second volume on his thought, but that's a little bit dated at this point as a study of Tillich. But ultimately, like I said, you should try to get most of your reading from his systematic theology. And so I want to talk a little bit of a reading strategy for his systematic theology. So it comes in 5 parts in 3 volumes. A recommendation that my professor at Luther Seminary, who I mentioned, Lois Malcolm, described is he starts in part 1 about correlating reason and revelation. Her recommendation was to actually skip the introduction where he describes his method of correlation and go right to the section that describes revelation, and then to read the section on reason, and then to read the introduction, and then from there to proceed with the rest of the volume. So the second section in volume 1 is on being in God. His second volume on Christology is about Christ in existence, and then he has history and eschatology in the third volume. And so that's a useful strategy. Another one that I would maybe recommend too is, if you're wanting to get to the core of Tillich, go right to his Christology. I think that second volume is really helpful for just diving in and understanding actually that Tillich is a thoroughly Christian theologian who's doing something really interesting about how to understand Christ's redemptive life and work. And so volume 2 is helpful, and then maybe going back to 1. But I think this is his masterpiece. I mean, most of the major ideas find their most mature form in this. And so all the other books are kind of very helpful, and he does present them in maybe different ways, helpful ways that are good for introductory, but you should maybe focus your reading on his system. And it's a really lovely system. It's concise, but he does have kind of this interconnectedness to it, so you can kind of understand it that way. Now, as far as secondary literature, I've mentioned my own book a few times. Of course, I recommend my own book. It's always a little bit funny to do so, but Paul Tillich in Plain English, I try to go through each of the main ideas of what I would consider main ideas in Tillich's thought. I look at some of his sermons. I look at some of the kind of stickier issues within his work. But three other books I would recommend beyond my own. If you're looking for a very good scholarly a study of Tillich, particularly within the historical context of Tillich, his philosophical context. This one by Christian Dans, The Theology of Paul Tillich, is excellent. It's really, really the place to go if you're looking for an academic reading of Tillich. So if you're working on Tillich academically, that's the one to look at. For a little bit more kind of approachable understanding of Tillich, the Abraham Pillars of Theology, study on Tillich by Donald Musser and Joseph Price I thought was very helpful. And then I also enjoyed this one, Daniel Peterson Tillich. I thought this was clear and helpful book as well. And both of these are fairly short. The Dan's book's a little bit longer. There's also the Cambridge Companion to Paul Tillich. I didn't grab that one, but there's a few others as well. Gilkey on Tillich is interesting as well. That's kind of a classic in the study of Tillich, but like I said, in my book, I have a bibliography with a number of other sources too that you might check out. But yeah, that's my recommendation for how to read Tillich if you're interested in him. I think he's somebody that's definitely worth the effort. He's worth the patient effort to understand him. And I describe in my book how I have with Tillich and with other theologians in this Plain English series that I've done, I've usually adopt this sort of hermeneutic of generosity, where I try to be generous to a thinker and not to be overly critical at first, but try to truly understand them before I make any judgment. And so I recommend that as well for Tillich. There's a lot of critiques that exist about him, but I think that he's a major theologian of the 20th century that's worth taking seriously. And so hopefully that's helpful for you, and hopefully you take up some reading of Tillich. But feel free to drop a comment of maybe your favorite Tillich book. Maybe I didn't mention one that you really enjoyed. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.